Hello everyone and welcome to Tasmania. Today we are doing something a little bit different. I'm actually talking about a documentary that disturbed me. We are talking about Girl in the Picture. I don't want to say too much, so let's just get into it. So in 1990, a woman is found barely alive on the side of the road in Oklahoma. So she's rushed to hospital and her husband, Clarence Hughes, arrives and identifies her as Tonya Hughes. He says she's a stripper down in Tulsa and that they share a 2-year-old son named Michael. Now Clarence, he is much older than Tonya and weird, as a lot of people put it. Now something isn't right. As doctors examine Tonya, they find bruises and injuries, but not new ones from this accident. They're old. So this wasn't just a random hit and run. And unfortunately, Tonya dies soon after. She's only 20 years old. So Tonya's co-workers want to notify her mother. But when they find her, she's confused. And she says, My Tonya died 20 years ago at 18 months. So that woman they buried wasn't Tonya Hughes. We go on to meet Karen Parsley, who was a dancer in a club called Passions. She danced with Tonya in 1989. She remembers Tonya as being very sweet and devoted. You know, her son Michael meant everything to her. But she also tells us how Tonya couldn't go anywhere alone with Michael. Karen had invited them to the zoo, but said she wasn't allowed. Karen would often see bruises on Tonya in the dressing room, but Tonya would just brush it off and say she'd slipped and fell. But Karen knew. Tonya at one point even confided in Karen, telling her how her husband Clarence had taken out a life insurance policy on her, and she was terrified. She wanted to run, she wanted to take Michael and escape. She just didn't know how. And that's a part of it that really bothered me as the documentary went on. And not a lot of bits did bother me in the documentary. I really enjoyed it. But there were so many times where Tonya could have been saved, but she wasn't. And it's... watching it and listening to some of these people speak, and it's just... The signs were there. It was so obvious. When Tonya was in hospital, Clarence phoned Karen to tell her that she wasn't allowed any visitors. Karen went anyway, diva, and the nurses said, "Oh, it doesn't look like a hit and run." Karen even saying how Tonya had scratches on her. So after Tonya's death, Karen became worried for Michael and called DHS. So then on May 1st, 1990, just a day after his mother died, Michael is placed in foster care with Merla and Ernest Bean. Ernest even said something about Michael, that he was messed up in a way, but he was a good kid. Now they raise him for the next 4 years, and that entire time Clarence is trying to get his son back. And then we finally see Clarence for the first time. It's a clip of him in court, quite angry. He's talking about Michael. He's trying to get Michael back, and he's saying how Michael's being punished for wanting to see him, and they're telling him that he's this mean man. And then we're told how Clarence isn't even Michael's real dad. Oh, okay. So, parental rights stop, the visits stop. The only win that you'll see in this documentary, really. And that same week, his foster mother sees a man in a truck driving very slowly past their house. And guess who? Yes, you guessed it, it was Clarence. And that brings us right to September 12th, 1994. Clarence, unable to accept that his son, not his son, but it's no longer his right. I don't know. I guess he raised him, so he thought he had the right to him. Clarence shows up at Michael's school, brandishing a gun, and kidnaps Michael and the principal. The principal is later found tied to a tree, but he's still alive. But Michael is gone. And then we meet FBI agent Joe Fitzpatrick. Now, I loved Joe in this documentary. He really dedicated his career and even his life, really, because after he retired, he went back to the case. So Joe finds that Clarence had tried taking out life insurance, but the social security number he used was a different name. And that name was Franklin Floyd. So Clarence Hughes isn't Clarence Hughes. So this man's real name is Franklin Delano Floyd. We also find out that he goes by many names, or he has created many names. Trent Davis, Warren Marshall, Clarence Hughes. At this point I didn't even really know what to call him as I was scripting this. I kind of went back and forth between Clarence and Warren. Franklin, Warren, Clarence. So pick a villain name and stick to it. Come on now. And then they pull his criminal record. He was an awful man. In 1962, they find out that he abducted and raped a 4-year-old girl. In 1963, he robbed a bank. He did serve time in prison, but in 1973, he attacked another woman. He then failed to show up to a court date and disappeared. He was a fugitive for nearly 2 decades. That is just mental. How do you vanish for so long when you're a wanted criminal? Now, because of all of this information, they suspect he has killed Tonya Hughes. So we now meet a woman named Jenny Fisher. She sees the news of Tonya, but to her, that's not Tonya. That's her high school best friend, Sharon. So Sharon Marshall. She was brilliant, incredibly smart. She was accepted into her dream college, Georgia Tech, with a full scholarship to study aerospace engineering. Like a literal genius. I struggle to just say the words. In this section we also meet a woman named Sherry, who was also friends with Sharon in school, and she tells us about the yearbook. She's showing us the yearbook. There's one picture. It's an ad in the yearbook that her dad bought. He bought a full-page ad to congratulate Sharon on the scholarship getting accepted into Georgia Tech. But the photo, it's a bit seductive. Well, as Sherry says, the other parents who would do things like this, they add in, school pictures or baby photos, not a model shoot. And Sherry poses the question, why would a father choose that picture? We go back to Jenny, who tells us how she got a call from Sharon one night. She was crying because she was pregnant. Said she's going to have the baby but put it up for adoption, and now her dad won't let her go to college. Later she calls again and said how they're moving to Arizona. Now she'll have the baby there and still put it up for adoption because daddy won't let her keep it. Now Jenny goes on to tell us about this one night where Sharon had invited her over to their house. When they were changing, getting ready for bed, Sharon opened up one of her drawers and it was filled with sexy lingerie. Remember, these are high school kids? And Sharon says, Daddy bought them for me. He lets me wear them.
She said, oh, Daddy buys the stuff for me, lets me have it.
And then Sharon's father barges in with a gun, screaming at them, what are you doing? Jenny screams. She tries to cover herself. They are changing this. They're both still in underwear. He laughs, says he's going to be back, and leaves the room. They change quickly, and then he comes back. He still has his gun. He orders Jenny to lay down on the floor and cover her face with a pillow. And she does that. Now, this was really hard to listen to. Obviously, Jenny's getting emotional speaking about it, and this was, I think, the second time that I got really just teary-eyed. He then proceeds to rape Sharon while Jenny is still in the room. They don't talk about it then, but the next day, Sharon goes over to Jenny's house, hugs her and says, "Daddy's just like that. You're okay. I'm okay. Just let it go." And Jenny never tells anyone, and I can see why, and she was young. She's obviously very traumatized by this, and you can see that by the way she speaks. She says herself that this moment changed her as a person. So at this point, we know that Sharon Marshall became Tonya Hughes, and Warren Marshall became Clarence Hughes. They got married in New Orleans, and that it seems like this bloke married his daughter. So at this point in the doc, we hear a few people talk about a young girl named Cheryl Comesso. She was friends with Tonya and Clarence, and she worked as a stripper also. And Clarence is obsessed with her. She's described as a very beautiful young woman, but also naive. We meet a woman named Michelle, who is Michael's babysitter. She talks about this one moment where she was in their trailer and they were putting on a movie or something. I think they were like those big tapes back then. Put one in to record something, and she sees a recording of Tonya and Cheryl topless at the beach. So by the way, I know Tonya and Clarence at the beginning are husband and wife, but at this point everyone thinks they're still father and daughter. So that's why this is really weird. Somehow everyone finds out about this video. I don't know how. They don't say how that information got leaked. There's a woman named Heather. I really liked Heather in this. She's a dancer, stripper as well. Heather basically confronts Cheryl about this video. And Cheryl goes on to say how Clarence had basically promised to turn her into a star, that he could take pictures and videos of her and she'd be in Playboy one day. That typical grooming stuff. But she also says how Clarence became violent with her after she refused sex with him. And one day Heather walks out of the club to see Clarence and Cheryl screaming at each other. And Clarence screams at Cheryl that he's going to kill her. Heather intervenes and walks Cheryl away. And that was the last time Cheryl was seen. In 1995, a skull is found in Florida with 2 bullet holes in the back. It takes a whole year to identify her. It's Cheryl Comesso. So they actually identified her through pictures that were found taped underneath the principal's truck. See, Clarence stole that truck when he kidnapped Michael. They were able to match the photos to the remains because the shirt matched, and then later through dental records it was confirmed to be Cheryl. So in these photos there was also photos of Sharon when she was younger, and they're described as being mostly obscene. They were pornographic. So after identifying Cheryl, and with the photos being with the truck that he stole, Clarence is convicted of her murder and sentenced to death. Finally, some justice. But Michael is still missing, and Sharon's real identity is still unknown. So the breakthrough came when author Matt Burbeck wants to write a book about the case with the aim of finding out Sharon's real identity. He actually interviews Franklin, but Franklin talks endlessly about himself because narcissist love the sound of their own voice, but he denies everything else. And unfortunately, during the creation of this book, Matt was unable to find out Sharon's identity. But a year after the book was published, Matt receives an anonymous email that says, "Would DNA from Sharon's daughter help?" I'm sorry, what? Daughter? We didn't know about a daughter. New Orleans, 1989. A woman named Mary meets a couple who walks into an attorney's office saying they cannot afford to have another child, so this one needs to be placed up for adoption. That couple is Clarence and Tonya Hughes. 6 weeks later, Megan is born, and Mary becomes her adopted mother. So Megan and her family, they come across Matt's book and contact him. Can you imagine finding out that your entire origin story is a crime documentary? That's wild. In 2011, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children come into the picture, and we meet the forensic case manager, Ashley Rodriguez, and she inherited the small case file of Sharon's. Ashley wants to try another interview with him, so the FBI agents go to interview Franklin again. Franklin, for some reason, believes that they're his attorneys, and when they tell him they're not his attorneys, they're FBI agents and they're reopening Michael's case, he tells them, "Rather you keep that closed." But Franklin starts talking, as he does. He starts talking about how back in the day he was like good looking and whatever, and that he met this woman who had 3 daughters. One of the FBI agents, Scott, asks Franklin what was his name back then, and he answers, "Brandon Cleo Williams. A new name unlocked." So then Scott asks, what was the name of the eldest daughter? And he answers, "Well, it's the one you're here asking about." And he finally says it. Suzanne Sevakis. Suzanne Marie Sevakis. We finally have her name. They're able to get her birth certificate and the names of her parents, Sandra and Clifford, who are still alive. Sandra and Clifford were divorced when Sandra met Franklin and Brandon. They met at a church when Sandra had just lost custody of her 3 daughters. He promised to help them, help Sandra and help her children. Now the doc doesn't actually give you a timeline, but at some point they got married. And the relationship is abusive. Sandra tells us how Brandon would walk around with a knife and would basically threaten her and say she can't leave. Sandra ended up in prison for 3 days, and this is when Brandon, Franklin, Clarence, he actually kidnapped all 3 of her daughters. Again, I don't know how long after, but at some point he drops the other 2 girls, Allison and Amy, off at an orphanage, but he disappears with Suzanne. So in the interview, we go back to Scott, who talks about how he slams his fist down on the table and says to him, "How did you kill him, Floyd? How did you kill him?" Franklin finally admits, "I shot him in the back of the head twice to make it real quick." He claims to have buried Michael on the Texas-Oklahoma border. They searched for him for a couple of days, day and night, but Michael's remains have never been found. So the doc ends with everyone speaking about Suzanne, like the people who loved her, and it's very emotional. I got teary-eyed so many times during the doc, but this part hit and I couldn't hold it in, and I literally bawled for the final 5 minutes. Matt, the author, he says how he wants to change the name on her tombstone, because at the moment it still reads Tonya, but that's not who she is. And we get a nice reveal of her new tombstone with the people who loved her surrounding it. Now it finally reads Suzanne Marie Sevakis. And that's a very beautiful picture of her in the top. And if that bit didn't hit you hard enough, we see that Meghan is pregnant. And she has a son who she names Michael. And you can believe it, I cried. Skye Borgman, how dare you make me feel such emotion. And as sad as this doc was, I really did enjoy it. It slowly unravels all the mysteries and identities. Like, you're going along with it, so you're finding it out with these people. But it never loses its focus on the human cost at the centre of it all. And one thing we never learn is Michael's real dad. We're just told that Franklin isn't his real dad and then never go back to it. I'm assuming it's because Franklin would force Suzanne to sell herself. So I think that's a fair assumption to make, that it was one of those moments. The pacing of this documentary is also incredibly well done. It doesn't rush it, but it also doesn't drag, which I saw a couple of people say that it was a bit slow moving. I was a bit worried about that going into it. So I do get bored easily, especially of movies and documentaries, but I was engaged the whole time. Overall, Girl in the Picture, it's devastating, but it's powerful and it's very carefully constructed. Because it's such a heartbreaking story, it really needs that type of care put into it. And even in the unanswered questions, it reminds us how much was taken and how much can never fully be recovered. But yeah, Girl in the Picture, 10 out of 10 recommend. I'm done yapping. I'm at least done crying. It is a tough watch, not the hardest one out there. But if you're also very sensitive, like I am, you will cry. So if you want that, thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.